Okay, here's a really easy question. What do real-time strategy games, point-and-click adventures, rhythm games, beat-em-ups, and arcade shooter games all have in common? I'll give you a clue, it's not a sense of enduring popularity. All 5 of these genres were, at one point in time, incredibly successful, profitable, and cutting edge, but nowadays they are anything but. Shoot-em-ups and brawlers ruled the arcade era, but swiftly went out of fashion as home consoles and PCs began to dominate the market. Point-and-click adventures and real-time strategy games were among the biggest genres back in the ancient age of antiquity that was the late 1990s, but by the time the 2010s had gotten going, both genres were in a humiliating freefall that they never really recovered from. And as for rhythm games, that whole genre exploded in the mid-noughties, grew to be absurdly popular, and then was deader than disco within a decade. To put it fairly bluntly, all 5 of these genres are, if not dead, then are kind of on life support, where once they were at the forefront of gaming culture, now they're niche, commercially risky, and mostly spend their time circling the drain of nostalgia. This is hardly new information, is it? You don't need me to explain to you that certain things are less popular than they used to be, and that the gaming zeitgeist is basically always shifting. However, I bet you can't explain to me why a whole bunch of gaming genres that emerged at broadly the same time as the extinct ones I mentioned didn't die and are in fact alive and well when their contemporaries flamed out decades ago. Platformers and fighting games got going at around the same time as the other retro classics, but they're still going strong, while brawlers and shmups got left in the arcade dust. 4X strategy games and first-person shooters can also attribute their rise to the same home computing boom that popularized the RTS and the point-and-click, but only some of them made it to the 2020s unscathed. And as for rhythm games, it's crazy to think that both they and the survival genre can trace their lineage back to around 2005, but where survival games are bigger than ever, Guitar Hero controllers are only ever found in ancient Viking burial sites. Across all of gaming's history, it feels like it's only certain kinds of game that stand the test of time, and of them there's only a few that seem to have the kind of longevity that can make them stick around for as long as the immortal likes of platformers and shooters. And the one thing that's really stood out to me over my many years of thinking way too hard about video games is that I've never really got a satisfactory answer as to why that is. For all people on the internet love to talk about how X genre is dying or about how Y trend is dead, what happens to cause entire genres to fade into history rarely gets discussed, and neither do these lazy doomsayers seem particularly interested in answering the question of if genres are constantly dying out, then where do the new ones even come from to replace them? And furthermore, why is it that sometimes genres that used to be dead mysteriously come back to life? Metroidvanias and old-school CRPGs all but vanished for upwards of 15 years, only for both of them to come screaming back into the limelight comparatively recently. And now, if anything, there's too many of them. The more questions we ask about video game genres, the more it becomes extremely apparent the way we tend to assume they work, which is to say, basically randomly, simply isn't true. There is some sort of underlying order to what causes video game genres to live, or die, or sometimes come back from the dead. But I don't think anyone's really attempted to explain why any of this happens, or what it is about the ecosystem of video game genres that causes it to refuse to stay still for even a second. Basically, the question I'm asking is, what is the life cycle of a video game genre? Where do baby genres come from, how do they grow and change over time, and what happens to cause them to die or go into hibernation? Well, I'm gonna disappoint you by saying that the reason why certain video games live and others die is a little bit more complicated than simply it being that the good, fun, creative genres that everyone likes are the ones to stick around, and that it's the bad, archaic relics of a bygone age that don't. Not only are video game species much less fixed and rigid than we tend to assume, but the line between evolution and extinction for our favourite games is much more blurred than it initially appears. But if I could boil it down to one single observation that won't make much sense right now, but just trust me here, it's that I think the number one most important factor in determining the longevity of a gaming genre has nothing to do with any one individual gameplay element or design tradition, and everything to do with its capacity for change. This brings me on to what I would describe as a rough 3-step approximation of the life cycle of a particular genre. Much like how species in the real world first emerge as a mutation of an existing lifeform, fight to forge their own ecological niche, and then invariably find themselves mutating or adapting once again, so too do video games undergo the same kinds of evolution, with each step representing another stage of their development, but also another obstacle to their continued survival. To begin with, a genre exists in a raw, unrefined state, drawing inspiration from existing titles to assemble a loose collection of ideas that will one day form a coherent genre. Then the genre establishes its own internal rules and begins to stand on its own and develop its own design tradition, allowing for later stage entries to use this foundation to start twisting the established format in new and interesting ways, eventually inspiring a new wave of pioneers who will hopefully go on to create their own genres, in a beautiful cycle of life. On that subject, you might notice here that I haven't sketched out the life cycle of a genre as something with a linear, birth-to-death straight line. And that's on purpose. An important part of how I think genres work, and I think our biggest misconception about them, is that genres don't die when they elapse some sort of arbitrary lifespan as the eternally youthful staples of the gaming world show. Instead, I think a genre starts to die when it stops engaging with this evolutionary process and fails to progress through this developmental cycle. Now, it's all very well me saying that some abstract idea of evolution is what causes games to live or die, and showing you a little graphic that took me upwards of 5 minutes on Paint to make, but in order to actually explain why this happens, we'll need to look at these various stages in more detail so I can explain why it's these evolutionary milestones in particular that form the basis for the continued survival of various genres, and also where new genres come from to fill the gaps left behind by their dead predecessors. Speaking of which, the first stage of a genre's development are the pioneers, and this step is unique because, as I mentioned, it is not a natural development of an existing genre, but a mutation from elsewhere, with designers taking inspiration from an existing technology, mechanic, or piece of art from beyond the world of video games and using it to explore design space that hasn't been explored before, either taking a single concept and expanding it into a whole game, or reimagining a game through the lens of this mutagenic inspiration, carving out a new design niche for itself in the process. A great example of a genre pioneer is the original Metal Gear game, largely considered to be one of the main pioneers of what would eventually become the stealth genre alongside stuff like the OG Wolfenstein games before they went on to pioneer the first-person shooter. The original pioneering stealth games primarily took inspiration from arcade maze games where avoiding enemies was the primary challenge, but remixed that idea into a slower-paced experience focusing not on frantic action but strategy and timing and manipulating simple AI systems, creating something entirely new out of concepts that already existed. In fact, Hideo Kojima, Mr. Metal Gear himself, directly cites Pac-Man as an early influence on the Metal Gear series. So, without that boring old game, we never would have gotten the Metal Gear Rising soundtrack, so maybe it was worth it after all. A more modern example of a genre pioneer is, weirdly, the early Minecraft mods Industrial Craft and Buildcraft, which fairly modestly tried to add more automation into the game, but in so doing accidentally blazed the trail of a whole new genre. They were the primary design basis for Factorio, and thus also for the many games of the factory genre that ripped off Factorio wholesale, and they're a great example of the sometimes chaotic way that video game genres can mutate. By the very nature of the fact that they're experimental and forging out into new design territory, pioneering games are often pretty rough around the edges, and so often don't get the same credit as their later, more refined successors. But that doesn't make them any less important. Pioneers are responsible for doing the hard work of cracking the fundamental concepts of a genre, and ultimately making it work, establishing a series of lessons and blueprints for everything that comes after to build from. At time of writing, synergy construction, watch a big number get bigger games of the Balatro mold are insanely popular, but that game wouldn't have existed without the comparatively obscure Luck Be a Landlord, a game that's all about mimicking a slot machine and that operates under the same exponential break-the-rules strategizing that Balatro would later popularize, and the local thunk cites as a direct influence on Balatro, which did more or less the same thing, but with higher production values and a bit more emphasis on skill expression over pure randomness. Of course, that's not to imply that pioneers usually crack what a genre is all about on the first try. Practically all genres draw from the experience and lessons of multiple pioneers as they establish themselves, and it usually takes a few attempts for people to find a formula that sticks. The survival horror genre might have really gotten started with Resident Evil, but that game needed to borrow the camera angles of Alone in the Dark, the resource management of Sweet Home, and the tedious, boring puzzles of Clock Tower, all horror pioneers, to become what it is today. And even Nintendo needed to take a couple of run-ups of the platformer first before they nailed the formula. Donkey Kong and the original Mario Bros, that's Mario Bros without the Super, are kind of unplayable nowadays because they lack a lot of the core features that we expect out of a platformer, stuff like air control, the elegant design of enemies you can jump on, and horizontal scrolling levels. But without these pioneering games to make all those mistakes, Nintendo never would have cracked Super Mario Bros. That then set the tone for every platformer going forwards. The key thing to remember is that a pioneer is unrefined. It's a blind stumble out into potential design space and an experimentation into what works and what doesn't. As a result, most would-be pioneers usually fail to inspire anyone to develop and refine them further, or simply don't get seen by the right people, meaning that the genres they would create end up dying before they've really gotten started. This has led to some interesting historical situations where stuff like the Oregon Trail educational game basically did the whole incredibly lethal randomized adventure you master over successive attempts thing close to a decade before Rogue got credited with pioneering the roguelike, meaning that if things went a bit differently, we'd be calling them Trail-likes instead, which is somehow an even worse name. A good example of a pioneering genre flaming out too soon can be seen in the rhythm games I mentioned earlier. Because the companies making stuff like Guitar Hero and Rock Band had no ideas to develop this fledgling genre further, and no financial incentive to even try, rhythm games mostly floundered around as a shallow, gimmicky experience that people kinda got bored with pretty quickly, leaving the genre mostly, but not quite, dead. An exemplar is what comes after the pioneers, and it's these games that serve as the fundamental canonical template for a particular genre. Note that I said exemplar singular. Almost always in game design, a genre can be boiled down to a single game that takes all the rough but promising ideas of the pioneers and puts them all into a single quintessential package that establishes the fundamental rules and design traits of a newly formed genre. Exemplars aren't always the most popular or even the best entries in a particular genre, but they are almost always, by nature, the most influential, establishing themselves as the template for a genre going forwards. A good exemplar example would be Street Fighter 2 when it comes to fighting games. There were fighting games before Street Fighter 2, shocker, and there were better fighting games that came afterwards, but all the fundamental design rules, like different fighters having particular movesets, the block, grab, attack trifecta, and combo moves, all of which we can still see today in everything from Street Fighter 6 to Marvel vs. Capcom to Super Smash Bros., first came together in Street Fighter 2 and demonstrate its enduring influence. Essentially, whenever you think of the archetypal game of a particular genre, that one's almost always going to be the exemplar. Slay the Spire is the archetypal deck-building roguelike, with practically every game that came afterwards copying everything from its progression mechanics to its look at 3, pick 1 reward structure. Civilization is the archetypal 4X strategy game, establishing stuff like the now omnipresent tech tree, and Super Metroid is the archetypal Metroidvania, with all subsequent Metroidvanias copying literally everything from it. Once an exemplar is established, the genre as we know it is finally complete, and what comes afterwards is the process of streamlining and developing a now functional genre, as competing designers work not to realize the potential of an idea, but to optimize concepts that already exist. However, the process of a game establishing itself as the exemplar rarely happens cleanly, and sometimes there can be multiple competing templates for a particular genre, often leading to a schism as the two design philosophies diverge. Probably the clearest example of that happening can be seen in racing games. Despite drawing from the same pool of pioneers, the genre ended up splitting into the arcadey design lineage, typified by Ridge Racer and leading to stuff like Burnout and Need for Speed, and the more simulation-focused style, best represented by Gran Turismo, and leading to stuff like Forza and Project Cars. Two very different genres that get unfairly lumped together as just racing games. There's also Mario Kart in there somewhere, which is its own weird take on racing games, with its own horde of copycats. Nintendo get everywhere, they're like rats. Not only that, a previously unquestioned exemplar can be dethroned by a more refined or more popular challenger. A big example here is the changing identity of the Battle Royale genre. To begin with, the Battle Royale, drawing from a design history of tense survival-inspired mods and milsim games like Armor, was a slow-paced and very tactical genre, as can be seen in the original king of the Battle Royale, PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds. In PUBG, running around wildly, getting into fights, and generally acting chaotically was a very quick way to lose half an hour of progress to a sniper you had no idea existed until you were dead on the floor. But after the release of Fortnite's Battle Royale mode, which we often forget was a quick hack job last-ditch attempt to save the real game that nobody wanted to play, it quickly overtook PUBG in popularity and became the new template by which all Battle Royales were judged, featuring much more aggressive gameplay, much shorter round times, and a bigger emphasis on getting loot and moving around the map quickly over raw tactical shooter skill, an influence that can still be felt in basically all the Battle Royale games that followed in Fortnite's wake. Even though they're more about cementing and building off what the pioneers laid down, exemplars are still a part of this constant evolutionary motion, and it's the sad fate of many genres to die not because their defining games were bad, but because they became too culturally dominant and ground their respective genres to a halt. We see this all the time in genres where an exemplar has reigned for too long without meaningful competition. Until the prodigal son Final Fantasy XIV revived itself and lit a fire under the MMORPG, World of Warcraft had successfully conquered the entire genre, and as a result, was slowly suffocating under its own unchallenged bloat. But now, with some actual competition in the space, both games are not only providing two different experiences, but the rivalry has revitalized a once stagnant genre, and both games are doing pretty well for themselves. Soulslikes are also a growing example of this problem, contributing to what people are calling Souls-like fatigue. Dark Souls is a game so beloved and so influential, cementing a genre that started way back in the day with Kingsfield and Demon Souls, that the ideas it had have begun to calcify around it, becoming intractable parts of the genre's identity and stifling innovation. These games in no way need dark fantasy settings, super arcane lore, an absence of tutorials, and weird androgynous people who haven't heard of shoes, but these things have become obligatory inclusions in any Souls-like game because that's what Dark Souls did, and it's become too influential to ever question, contributing to a lack of meaningful change within the genre. That's not to say these copycat Souls-likes are bad games, of course. Many of them are really good, not you Lords of the Fallen, get out of here, but far too few meaningfully rock the boat, and that is what's really required for a genre's long-term survival. Which brings me onto twists. As a genre matures and the rules established by the exemplar cement themselves, it eventually becomes advantageous to start to defy established genre convention and try something a bit different. These types of subversive games that occur late in a genre's lifecycle are what I'm calling twists. And rather than building up a genre's rules, they instead use genre traditions as a jumping off point to subvert and defy those expectations instead, while still, broadly, following the genre's core rules. A genre that's in the twist stage right now is the survival game. It got started with pioneering greats like Pathologic, Lost in Blue, and Unreal World, then cemented its rules with a little game that you may have heard of, developed by Hatsune Miku called Minecraft, and is currently filled with so many games that to a greater or lesser extent rip off Minecraft's open world survivaling, the people are looking for a change, opening the door to twists that upend the formula and take survival games in a bold new direction. The recently released Abiotic Factor, for example, eschews the traditional progression model of something like Minecraft, where your tools gate what resources you can gather, as well as the typical undeveloped open world format, and replaces them with an almost entirely indoor setting of a ruined science facility and restructures the progression to be much more linear and story-based, creating something that's still recognisably a survival game, but one that consciously defies the rules rather than trying to build upon them. Every suitably mature genre has its own collection of twists that exist as a reaction to and a mutation of what came before them just as much as anything else. Diablo spun off from the live die repeat roguelike dungeon crawler back in the day to zero in on the fun of having to scavenge treasure to survive against ever tougher monsters, and historical simulation titles like most Paradox games are a twist that goes all the way back to tabletop games, and are all about replacing the abstract strategy of 4X games with a much greater focus on simulation of actual historical events, and by de-emphasizing actually winning. Genre mashups are also their own kind of twist, as it's only really possible to imagine how two disparate genres will fit together when they're both already mature and have defined rules. Braid combined puzzle gameplay with the navigational action of a platformer. Overwatch is what you get when you take a loadout system like you'd find in a shooter and mash it up with MMO-style class design and the holy trinity of tanks, damage dealers, and healers, and Hollow Knight and the aforementioned Silksong are a mashup of Souls-like boss fights and Metroidvania-style ability progression. Now, in case you didn't notice, every single one of these twists has led to the creation of their own genre of varying sizes, of which they became the exemplars, not replacing the games they twisted away from, but making something entirely new in their image. And even when a successful twist doesn't start its own genre, they're often experimental enough to serve as inspiration for a whole new bunch of pioneers. Just look at how the climbing mechanics from Breath of the Wild, a open world inspired twist away from the established Zelda formula, ended up inspiring the core mechanics and stamina systems of a bunch of new climbing games like the pioneering Ashore Hike and the exemplar in the making, Peak. The point is that a healthy genre is one that is in constant motion, growing to a point of stability, and then branching off to either reinvent itself, split apart into mutant microgenres, or to inspire a new generation of pioneers, in a never-ending cycle that's been going on not just for the entire history of video games, but the entire history of all art. And to call us back to the start of the video, this is what I mean when I say that the fundamental criteria for the health of a genre is its capacity for change. Not because certain genres stay the same forever, but because all genres are in a constant rhythm of evolution, mutation, and reinvention. The only genres to actually die are the ones that lose their momentum in this eternal cycle. This idea of genres being reborn into different shapes and forms also explains the truth of why platformers and shooters, the seemingly immortal genres of the video game world, have lived for so long, where others have faded from the spotlight. Simply put, they haven't. Every few years, or around a decade, both genres are fundamentally remade in exactly the same cycle as everything else. The only thing that doesn't change is their name. Compare the original first-person shooters, Wolfenstein 3D and Doom, to the cinematic shooter trend that started with Half-Life, to the era of streamlined console shooters with stuff like Call of Duty Modern Warfare, to the rise of the Counter-Strike style tactical shooter, and to the new kid on the block, boomer/movement shooters. And that's not even counting spin-offs like third-person cover shooters and hero shooters. I have said that word way too much, I don't know what it sounds like anymore. Each of these different kinds of games are completely distinct to each other, and each have their own pioneers, exemplars, and twists. The only thing that connects them is a shared evolutionary lineage and some pretty good branding. And the same is true for platformers, being split pretty evenly into eras encompassing 2D platformers, the first 3D collectathon style platformers, hybrid, more level gimmick centric platformers, and the most recent trend of sandboxy, exploration focused platformers, with Nintendo usually leading the way. The beauty of art is that nothing ever really goes away forever. Even if genres might lose steam and temporarily die out, those works of art are still around and are still just as capable of inspiring people as they were at release. This can be seen all the time in the indie resurgences of various genres. Eric Barone single-handedly revived the cozy farming sim game by adding in more modern features like quests, combat, and crafting to the Harvest Moon template. The Metroidvania didn't even really exist until indies across the world worked to capitalize on the potential that Nintendo and Konami got bored of developing, and devs like Owlcat, Larian, and the former Zaum brought the CRPG back from the dead with a combination of a renewed focus on narrative and some advanced systems for modeling physics and dynamic battlefields that brought the genre back to its tabletop roots. All of these new games were inspired by something old, but rather than simply remaking what came before them, they improved on things and installed themselves as the new exemplars, bringing their respective genres back to life. Even many of the dead genres I mentioned at the start never really died completely, they just took on new forms. The point-and-clicks appeal was never the terrible puzzles, it was always in the stories, and that influence is alive and well in the branching paths of narrative adventure games today. Traditional rhythm games might have died out, but that's not stopped a new breed of rhythm action games from taking up their musical mantle to explore new, more interesting forms of gameplay. And while the RTS is mostly in the past, due to the fact that StarCraft got too big and nobody wanted to play anything else, its successors in the form of city-building management games, which spiked in popularity around the same time that the RTS began to decline, and Dota-style games, which began life as mods, are doing great. And who knows, maybe once all the ex-Blizzard devs who keep trying to make inferior versions of games that they already made and that are still good, we can come back to the RTS and, you know, give it a proper revival treatment. Long story short, video game genres are weird. And the thing that makes them weirdest of all is that it's impossible to ever truly get to know them, because once you think you've got a genre pinned down, suddenly it's sprouted a million new mutations, its name has changed, and all the games you thought were cutting edge are now considered venerable classics. But it is that chaotic, ever-shifting nature that makes the perpetual motion machine of artistic development so endlessly compelling. Sure, gaming genres die all the time, and many of the kinds of game we love right now probably won't be anywhere near as relevant in a decade's time. But rather than games slowly dying off until we're left with just one, the passing of a genre into decline and death is almost always an opportunity for an explosion of pioneering successors to rise from its ashes. And it's the responsibility of us as players to seek out those interesting new games that are driving the medium forwards and doing cool new things with the ideas and concepts we already love, and help nurture them until they can stand on their own as a brand new game. So, the next time that you're mourning the death of a favourite genre that's either in decline or lost to history, don't lose hope, because in all likelihood, its best ideas are alive and well, just in another form. All you've got to do is look slightly further afield and open your mind to some new interpretations, and you'll find that the experiences that you love are probably more active than ever. And even if they aren't, it's only a matter of time until they come back to life. Which is to say, if you're looking for the next big thing after Soulslikes, can I recommend the Haley 3D feet-posing drawing reference software? There's just something about it, you know? I really feel like it keeps the soul of the franchise alive. You know what I mean? Hello, and welcome to this, the After the Video segment. That thing where I sit you down and we have a very serious talk about some cool things/people that you should be paying attention to, and also me. Despite coming out quicker than the last few, this video was delayed by a few days because of Silksong, and I think we can all agree that that's basically warranted, so for the first time I feel no guilt whatsoever. Anyway, the first thing I want to talk about in this After the Video bit is to answer a question that I get a lot, and that's, where do I find out about all these cool games that I play? Well, one of the main methods that people might not be aware of is to listen to other talented folks who make it their business to curate big lists of underappreciated titles that are good and deserve more coverage. Therefore, what I've done is select 3 of my favourite video game curators on the internet, who collectively make up about half of my reasons to ever check social media, and put their latest lists in the description. Hopefully you'll find something you like, and also you can support these cool people who have many talents outside of feeding me lists of video games as well. go check them out. But if you're really looking for some people to check out, then I can only recommend my loyal supporters, who are, let's be honest, some of the best people on the internet. Now, you may have heard that some YouTube shenanigans are causing views and such to tank across the board, and this channel is hardly immune, and so it really means a lot to have my patrons and YouTube members at my back. Without that kind of support, this channel would literally not exist, so if you can spare a few bucks that would potentially be able to go towards me buying food, please do consider throwing them my way. I will be greatly appreciative, and in return, you'll even get some cool behind the scenes videos, some extra game design content, earlier access to videos, and your name in the credits. Of course, if you can't spare the cash, a like and a comment and a subscribe or a ding in the bell or whatever the fuck that's supposed to do also helps immeasurably as well. Thank you for whatever you can do. And did I say something about credits? Yes, I did. For my top tier $10 supporters, the best of the best, you also get me reading out your name, and sometimes a special apology from me when I forget you like I did last time. Sorry. Anyway, those people are Ali Wright, Andrew Lebrano, Auna94, Bobby, Brian Notariani, Konstantin Amend, Cosmix360, Daniel Medjes, Dirk Jan Karambeld, Digletier, Dis Ellie, Ekton, Edward Franklin Woods, Edwina the Spacebun, Eric Woolston, Eugene Bulkin, Fullabaxi, Furious Hulk, Gazkul, How, Heck It's Noah, I Support Trans Rights, didn't need to pay me to say that one, Jacob Dylan Riddle, Jinkaloid, Joshua Bonswanger, Kevin Help Us, Conlove, Kangi, Luke Kokoran, Macewinder54, Maxim Filipov, Mark Vallant, May Contain Fox-Like Substance, Mika Oi, Michael C, Mike Oxlong, Nate Graff, Oliver Marhofer, Patrick Romberg, Peter Tomasic, Raudkull, Redadex, Regal Regex, Seslux, Silver Folfy, Tyler Duncan, Timotheus Bexek, Whimsical Wisp, Zach Brandmeier, and ciao. Okay, that's it from me. Bye!